Welcome to the CEO Tech Talks podcast, where vision meets impact. I am your host, Ambreen Ahmed. Each episode, I sit down with exceptional leaders who are shaping the future of business, technology, and transformation. This show is about more than just success. It's about clarity, purpose, and those bold decisions that light the way forward. Join me as we uncover the insights, challenges, and breakthroughs from today's most inspiring voices. Leaders who are redefining what it means to lead in a rapidly changing world. This is CEO Tech Talks. Let's dive in. Today, my guest is Zeus Kerravala, one of the most recognized and respected voices in enterprise IT, cybersecurity, and networking today. He's a regular contributor to Network World, SiliconANGLE, and eWeek, known for his clear, actionable perspectives on AI-driven infrastructure, digital transformation, and secure enterprise evolution. Thank you for joining, Zeus. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, let's get into it. So what do you do? What is your role? What is your company? Please tell us everything.
Yeah, so I run ZK Research. I'm an industry analyst. And while there's many of us out there, I'm not your traditional industry analyst. And what I mean by that is if you talk to an analyst from one of the big firms or whatever, they have a very kind of well-defined coverage area that they live and die with, right? So you cover Wi-Fi or contact center or something like that. My coverage area tends to ebb and flow a bit more. It's always been my belief that market share gains and losses happen when markets transition. And to me, it's those market transitions that I find most interesting. And so I try and live in those transitions. And so the way I kind of describe it is if the value from the analyst is how many widgets got sold that quarter, there's lots of firms that do that, right? And so if you think about like where networking is today, as an example, 5 years ago, I was looking at things like SD-WAN, right? But today that's a very mature market. The vendor landscape is pretty well defined. And so I'll look at it just from a cursory perspective, but now I'm much more focused on how, say, AI is changing networking and what the next wave of Wi-Fi will be, things like that. Same with security. If you were to ask me who's got a better firewall, I don't know, they're all kind of the same, right? At the high end, it's a pretty mature market. But in security, again, how AI is changing that and also how those products are being platformized. And so to me, it's those transitions that cause end users to change their buying habits. And I want to live in those transitions and advise companies on who the next wave of strategic investments are that they should be making.
That sounds exciting and pivotal. So what does a typical day look like for you?
It's a lot of calls. There's 4 audiences that I serve. One's the vendor community, in which they typically brief me on what they're doing, or I'll do some message testing to help them. Then there's the resellers of products, investors, typically private equity and buy-side firms. And then lastly, there's the end users, the companies that actually buy the products. And so again, there's a lot of analysts out there and they typically focus on one of those areas. I try and understand the lens at which each of those audiences look through to those products. And so, of course, enterprises buy products, resellers sell products, investors invest in products, and then the vendors manufacture them. And so between those 4 audiences, I think I have a pretty good 360-degree view of where technology is going. And so my day is typically made up, probably a good 3/4 of the day is made up of calls with those audiences. And then I always have to find time to write the content for the sites that you mentioned, as well as I have my own video series in which I do a lot of thought leadership interviews. And then of course there's the event circuit. And so I go to a lot of different analyst events, industry conferences, things like that. And so that takes up a lot of my time. In fact, I think I'm traveling every week between now and Thanksgiving. And then right after Thanksgiving, AWS is a reInvent conference. And so, but then it typically winds down for the month of December. All writing and travel.
How do you balance independence and collaboration in your role as a trusted advisor to major vendors or all 4 audiences that you've mentioned?
Yeah, well, I don't, I try and be as honest as I can with each of those audiences, right? And so I feel it's my job to really try and cut through a lot of the hype and help each of those audiences understand how to best position their product, their whatever their needs are, right? So I don't want to overhype a certain technology or vendor if I don't think it's ready, because then when companies buy it, then they deploy it, they're going to get, disappointed. And I think balancing that independence, I think, is probably the most important thing I do. And frankly, if I didn't do that well, I don't know if I would have had the success I have. And so, there's different ways to do that. Obviously, when dealing with the vendor community, a lot of the closed door discussions are different than the ones that I might do publicly, right? I never want to embarrass a company, but I do need to tell them the things they need to hear. With end users, it's a lot of just work helping them understand the technology landscape, right? And what I've noticed, and so just to give you a sense of my background, I actually came out of corporate IT. I was a CIO for a while, and then I was actually at a reseller. And what I realize now, and what I didn't realize then, was typically enterprise IT decision makers are generally a good year behind where the technology curve is, and it's or more. And they're, in a lot of cases, they're just trying to, fight to survive to fight another day. I try and play a role where I help them look around the corner, but as accurately as I can.
You mentioned that AI is disrupting the market. What major shifts are you seeing right now in networking and cybersecurity from an AI perspective?
Yeah, that's a good question. In fact, you could ask what major shifts is AI having in any market right now. And I do think it's going to fundamentally change the products that we use. And I think it's interesting too, because I think within the context of networking and security, those are two of the technology sectors that have really shied away from a lot of automation technology historically. And they're very critical to their organizations. And so because of that, they've tended to live in if it ain't broke, don't fix it type of world. But I think the criticality of those technologies now is such where trying to do things the old way is not working anymore. And I'll give you just an interesting data point from my research. Last year, I ran a survey and I asked the survey respondents, how important is the network to your business operations compared to 2 years ago? And over 90% said it was significantly more important or more important. But then I asked, how complicated is it or complex is it compared to 2 years ago? And over 80% said, significantly or more complex. And so you've got these two opposing forces, more important, more complex, right? And so if those more complex keeps growing and more important keeps growing, you can see that that's not a recipe for success. So I think where AI is playing a role in networking and security is it's removing a lot of the heavy lifting and a lot of the manual processes that typically those folks had to do before. And so when you think about if your Zoom call isn't performing well and your, head of sales is calling your IT pro and saying, hey, we can't talk to customers because their Zoom calls are bad, the troubleshooting process would have been get a packet capture device, capture a lot of data, filter it through some kind of network analytic tool, and it could take a long time to do. Now with AI, it could actually predict those problems before they actually happen. So if you notice traffic growing, slowly but surely, and then when certain events happen, it causes those network outages. Right now, AI, I think, can shift networking and security from being highly reactive to predictive, which enables proactivity. And I take a lot of offense to some of the stuff I read in the media where it says IT is not proactive. It's not that they don't want to be proactive. They never had the tools to be predictive to enable them to be proactive, right? And so what AI does is it enables a level of predictiveness that finally allows network operations and SecOps to be proactive. Understand that these are difficult domains, right? Like Wi-Fi troubleshooting or trying to understand the source of a breach. People talk about it being a needle in a haystack, but it's actually a needle in a stack of needles, right? It is a very difficult. Those are some of the toughest things in corporate IT to do. And so without AI, these were problems that weren't solvable before, and now they are.
So you mentioned predictive AI. What about generative AI?
Yeah, well, generative is the ability to use it to create things. I think agentic is where the industry is going, in which you wind up being able to interact with the AI in a lot free. So if you think about the movie Iron Man, right, where Tony Stark talked to Jarvis, and That's actually where we're heading. You'll be able to actually ask it, you know, are there any problems in my network and what's causing those problems and things like that. And so I think that's where we're getting to, is where AI will become the network engineer or the security engineer's best friend. It will be that true co-worker. And here's where I think the industry is a little misguided, where people are concerned about AI taking jobs. It's not AI that's going to take your job. It's the engineer that uses AI that's going to take your job, right? And so I always say that, like, today you would never hire an accountant that doesn't know how to use Excel. Down the road, you're not going to hire an engineer that doesn't know how to use generative AI. And I think in fact, it was Scott Gutterman, who runs the digital platform for the PGA Tour, who said this to me, that AI allows the untrained eye to see what the trained eye does. And so think about that statement, right? Every organization has these really, really highly paid, highly expensive security and networking professionals. Your Cisco certified people and things like that. You can have them troubleshoot, some problems and things, but that's a very expensive resource to dedicate to something like that, and they can never go on with get on with the strategic things they're going to do. If generative AI and agentic AI can be used as that coworker to allow that first level engineer, second level engineer to have that same level of expertise as that high level engineer, not quite the same, right? But certainly for known problems, right? Then, that's a big win for the organization. And so if you think about where AI is useful, if you were to put all the kind of problems and issues on a network on a 2x2 grid and map them out with frequency of issue and complexity, anything low complexity, high frequency is perfect for AI to solve. And that's probably 80% of the issues. Anything that's a little bit more, bespoke or one-off, that's where you still need your people. And that's where a lot of the energy is focused. And so I think generative AI is the biggest innovation we've seen in networking and security in a long time, because it allows people to interact with the data that they're collecting much easier.
So, what's one area where hype and reality still haven't caught up in AI-driven IT? I think you've touched on it a little bit.
Well, I don't think our generative tools are quite there yet, right? I think there's been a lot of promises made by vendors. The road mapping to it, and I think I think 2025 will be known as the year of AI vision, where 2026 will be the year that it actually becomes real. And so everyone's got this on their roadmaps, and they've got some examples of some things they can do, but I don't know if companies really have the confidence yet to roll it out as a true co-worker, right? So there's a lot of kicking the tires going on. And so right now we are in a state where there's a lot of hype and vision, but not a lot of deployments. And I don't know if you saw that MIT study that got released that said 95%, and this isn't just to do with networking and security, but for all AI projects. The MIT study said that 95% of organizations realize the value from their AI pilots. Now, I think that data point's a little, it's a little bit headline grabbing. I suppose the way they wrote it, I would think that in the early days of cloud, if you had said how many companies had success, you'd probably would have said about only 5% as well. So, but I think that just shows you the immaturity of where the industry is yet. So just like cloud eventually got over that hurdle where companies now can deploy it and have a lot of success, so will AI. We're just, at that very, very early stage. You know, um, if you think about the typical hockey stick adoption of a technology, right, where it's flat blade, and then I think we're still on that flat blade. I think 2026, 2027 is where we'll hit the acceleration.
I have one more technical question. What role will edge computing play in AI-driven security-first networks?
Well, that is an excellent question. Edge computing to me is a necessary part of this. I would say, a couple of years ago, if I asked IT pros how they were thinking about AI, there was a big desire to try and centralize all their data and then apply AI there. Now, what I think companies are starting to understand is there is so much data being generated that you simply can't centralize it. And there's more and more. In fact, one of the things AI does a good job of is creating more data. In fact, at the Splunk conference, they showed a data point that said 55% of all data generated next year will be from machines. So these are machines creating data. And so the question is, if I can't centralize it all, what do I do with it? Well, it's better to leave the data where I need it and then apply AI to it there. And so that's the role of edge computing, is I want to leave the data at the edge. That could be a retail edge, that could be a stadium, that could be, a handheld device, right? Things like that. Just wherever the data is, leave it where it is, and then use edge computing to be able to apply AI at the source. And this is why there's been so much effort from the companies like NVIDIA and AMD and the companies that make these chips to make them smaller, less power consuming, so I can have these powerful AI systems at the edge and not just in the data center. But an AI laptop is an edge device too, right? You could think of like an AI laptop or even a camera as an edge device. In fact, I'll give you a great example. I was at the Global Citizen event, and I ran into a company called Farmer Lifeline Technologies that uses AI in cameras to understand whether crops are affected by pests, right? And Esther Kamani, the founder, was telling me that in Africa, enough food is wasted from pests and threats like that to feed 1 billion people. Big shortage there. And so the only way farmers there can actually understand whether there's pests and disease on their crops is to go inspect things manually. Now, through AI in a camera, they can inspect farm and very quickly tell you. Like, in fact, they can send you a text message saying you need to go look at this part of the crop, for disease or pest control. And so that's a great example of edge AI, right? That's not something that I'm centralizing data, just taking a look at the camera and give me some immediate data.
Let's focus on your business a little bit. So what's working well for you right now and what's been most frustrating?
What's working well? That's a good question. I haven't really thought about that. I guess, I think this concept of limiting the market transitions has worked well for me. And it doesn't really matter what industry it is, healthcare, retail. I do a lot of work in the cross section between sports and technology, right? Everybody's interested in how AI is going to change their industry. And so, this focus on market transitions, we're in the biggest market transition that we're going to see in technology probably in our lifetime, right? So this will be bigger than the internet. And so to me, that's worked really well. And I think it's fair to say, since the AI wave, I've had my business has had the best years it's ever had. And I think just because there's so much uncertainty out there. What do I find frustrating? I don't know if I find anything frustrating. Maybe all the travel, but that's sort of a necessary part of it. I do think, maybe if there is a point of frustration, is I do think that the vendor community tends to market well ahead of where end users are. And so being able to rein them back in and help them understand that companies aren't quite ready for this yet, bring some practicality to it. That I think is what's missing right now, is those really big lighthouse accounts and, of how they do things.
So which metrics do you focus on most in your business?
Just, for my own personal business to understand whether I'm doing well or not. Yeah, I think, probably subscription renewals, number of interactions, increase, because if I'm not getting questions about things, then I'm probably focused on the wrong areas, right? And, I guess number of increase is probably the most important thing, is how many questions am I getting about certain technologies? And that helps me understand where customers' heads are at.
How do you see the enterprise buyer changing post AI adoption?
That is an excellent question, right? And I get that question a lot. I think post AI, it's going to be very difficult for an IT buyer to operate in an environment where they don't understand the business somewhat, right? And so when I was in corporate IT, we made technology decisions for technology's sake. And the line of business was almost forced to use the technology, whether they wanted to or not, right? I think what's really changed, and this is fascinating, is like when I was in corporate IT, our business leaders were kind of scared of the technology. And I remember putting Windows on a desktop of a broker who was used to using DOS, and they didn't, they got all worried about it, right? Today, everyone's a technology expert. And you look at with the rise of AI, everybody plays with ChatGPT and Gemini and things like that at home, right? And so now they want to use it in the office. And so you could almost argue that the adoption curve of technology in the consumer world is well ahead of where it is in the enterprise. And I think this concept of the enterprise buyer has to be a mix of IT and and business leader. And whether that's a single person, maybe you have now in your future CIO, as a former head of sales or head of marketing or something like that, or there's just a more of a council, with the different businesses leaders working with IT to buy things. I think the business influence on IT decision making will continue to go up, and AI, I think, will cause that to have a step function in growth. And so, as a vendor, if you can't explain your technology in terms of how it's going to change the business, you're going to really struggle to sell. This isn't about speeds and feeds and, I can do this 10% faster than you can. It's about helping customers understand how it's going to change their business and how to get there from where they are today.
Okay, thank you. As a thought leader and mentor, how do you cultivate the next generation of analysts and technologists?
I think it's just really helping them look around the corner and understand what's real and what's not. And some of it's, if I'm being honest, it's a little bit of gut feel, right? It's just having been a buyer of the technology myself before and understanding, the challenges that companies have. But I think for the next generation of IT professional, it's really about not being scared of the technology and being willing to change, right? And I'll give you a little story. When I started my career, I was the fourth open systems person hired in a Wall Street firm that relied heavily on IBM mainframes, right? So I was a Windows Unix developer, right? Now I was the fourth one of those hired, and we had about maybe 200 IBM mainframe people. Within 5 years, we had maybe 1,000 people on the Windows Unix side, and maybe only 10 IBM mainframe people left. Now, of those 200 IBM mainframe people, none of them crossed the chasm to the world of Windows because they got stuck in their old way, right? And so, and if you look back at time, right, people that dealt with traditional voice systems weren't the ones to put voice over IP in. Your hardcore server administrator wasn't your VM administrator, right? And so, throughout history, technology changes, and the people that work with the technology have to keep their skill sets current. And I think that's the most important lesson, for IT buyers out there. If you're watching this and there's a part of your job that isn't really strategic to your resume anymore, don't do it anymore. Use AI to automate that out of your job and go focus on the next kind of important thing, because that'll keep your skill set relevant. And I think this is becoming more and more important because technology cycles are happening faster and faster. What used to take 10 years to happen as a market transition now happens in 2 years, right? And so, it's very important you keep your skill set current. And that's probably the single biggest message I've been trying to give to, everybody that I work with. It's keep your skill set current, because these transitions wait for nobody.
It's the reality we live in today.
Yeah. Yeah. Market transitions wait for no one. And I was at an event, and there was a speaker from Microsoft, and I think this was the most appropriate thing that I've heard. It says, in AI, there are no fast followers. You either lead this transition or you fall behind. And so you got to ask yourself, do you want to lead the transition or do you want to fall behind? And if you're close to the end of your career, maybe you ride this out and go off into the sunset. But if you're not, then you better keep your skill set current.
Wow, okay. So, where do you want ZK research to be 6 to 12 months from now?
I think still at the very front end of where the technology adoption cycles, I think we'll have a good understanding of where agentic AI is being developed or deployed. I think really interesting aspect is how these agentic tools are going to talk to each other, right? Because workflows aren't built on one application, right? They're built on multiple ones. And so I think, where I want ZK research to be is just to continue to be at the front end of the technology curve, because that's where companies seem to struggle the most.
Zeus, thank you for joining me on CEO Tech Talks. Your insights show how AI, cybersecurity, and innovation are converging to create a more resilient enterprise world.
Hey, well, thanks for having me.
For listeners who want to dive deeper, visit zkresearch.com or follow Zeus on LinkedIn and X. Thank you for joining CEO Tech Talks. I hope today's conversation sparked new insights and inspiration for your own leadership journey. Until next time, stay inspired, stay visionary, and keep leading with light. Brought to you by Neura AI Consulting.